Thanks so much, Singli, and thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to getting feedback. So as Singli mentioned, I will be presenting my dissertation research on illegal hunting in Southwest China. But I'd like to begin by discussing the issue of hunting as a pan-tropical conservation crisis. So the scope of bushmeat extraction in the Congo Basin and the Amazon Basin and across Southeast Asia is truly staggering. You have as much as millions of tons being extracted over a large catchment area per year. And we also know that the protein provided by bushmeat, the incomes provided by bushmeat, are critically important to rural villagers in the developing world. Some estimates place about 5 to 8 million individuals in the Amazon as being critically reliant on bushmeat for income or for protein access. And there's been compelling evidence from sites such as Madagascar, where Chris Golden worked, demonstrating that access to bushmeat reduces incidence of childhood anemia. At the same time, we know that the exploitation of wildlife, which once may have happened in a more sustainable fashion, is now spiraling out of control in many sites. We also know that the largest bodied species, so just a simple pictographic of some example species in Southeast Asia that are commonly harvested, ranging from tiny bamboo rats to this rhinoceros, and from small bulbuls to this giant ibis, we know that the larger bodied species are those that tend to be more imperiled due to overexploitation. This is significant since large-bodied species tend to be particularly important for certain ecosystem functions, including seed dispersal, plant germination, and they often exert strong top-down controlling effects on vegetation structure or the communities of vertebrates themselves. To study this problem, to study the issue of hunting, requires a truly socio-ecological framework where you have to consider the impacts of the hunter on the harvested wildlife stock, as well as the responses of the wildlife and how that in turn changes the hunter's behavior, and how there's this dynamic feedback loop between these two actors. This is complicated when hunting is made illegal, yet enforcement is weak, so that as a researcher, you're not a trusted member of the community, hunters don't have a strong incentive to talk to you honestly, so it's challenging to get accurate data, and yet hunting continues apace because of the massive material benefits and subsistence benefits offered by bushmeat access. So today I'll be discussing 4 different problems that I looked at, as well as how my research addressed each of those issues. So the first is hunting at many sites is indiscriminate across many species, particularly for subsistence and recreational hunters, a new class of hunters that I posit has been under-investigated across the tropics. This is less true, obviously, for commercial or market-based harvesters that might be targeting high-value species for products such as ivory. So in this first section, I'll be discussing whether or not simple rules can predict hunter-prey choice to simplify the complexity that researchers are often dealing with in the real world. The second issue is that at many sites, hunter behavior itself is poorly understood, particularly in Southeast Asia, where hunting has continued at extremely high rates despite heavily defaunated landscapes. So in this section, I'll be discussing what factors motivate hunters and how do they make decisions as a step toward better policies and implementations for the future. The third focus of my talk today is that hunting has continued despite sanctions in Southwest China and in other parts, again, of Southeast Asia. So I sought to identify what factors distinguish hunters from non-hunters in order to improve conservation policy. And the last is that, as I previously mentioned, large-bodied species are highly threatened, and they're disproportionately important for ecosystem function. So in the last section, in the most tentative, preliminary one, where feedback's particularly appreciated, I'm interested in mechanistically predicting which species are most likely to be extirpated, with an emphasis on size-biased defaunation. So let's jump in. So this first section really was done in collaboration with a fellow graduate student at Princeton, Sarah Drohan, who's been truly wonderful to collaborate with. And these are images from my field site in Southwest China and a bushmeat market in Laos, where you can kind of see the wide range of species being harvested, from these really, really small squirrels and rats to game birds. As a manager at a tropical field site, you're often faced with this really staggering problem. You have limited personnel, you have often, unfortunately, limited historical data on the status of wildlife populations, and you have limited financial resources to conduct monitoring. So you are faced with monitoring and managing a park where a wide range of species are harvested. So one way to kind of tackle this problem is to observe that hunters have preferences for different prey species. This comes from my field site in southwest China, and what we see is that hunters strongly prefer larger-bodied prey species. The mammals are so defaunated that the main target species left are wild boar and muntjac, which are really, really robust, resilient species. So one way to think about this is, okay, can we identify what set of species, based on their traits, are likely to be harvested, instead of having to think about a whole collection of individual species? So you could think, okay, in this system, maybe hunters harvest down to this level. They say, oh, below this rank score, it's not really worth my time to go out anymore. And then you could say, okay, it kind of intersects here. And what this gives you is a reservation value for body mass, or some other trait. You could think ornamentation, antler size for certain ungulates, and I'll denote that with epsilon. So the data requirements for this approach are fairly minimal compared to intensive multi-species, multi-population monitoring techniques. All you need is some sense of what the distribution of prey is. Here I am in the field doing bird and mammal line transects. And you need to know, from the hunter perspective, how they translate one unit of, say, body mass, right, a muntjac at 20 kilograms, to the utility or value that they place on it. And then you ideally should know their opportunity cost of the time that they're spending in the field on a typical hunting trip. This contrasts with the traditional way to understand hunters in a wide, indiscriminate hunting system where they target a wide range of species, which has been optimal foraging theory, which was very successfully adopted in the 1980s by ethnographers and anthropologists working with subsistence hunters in the Amazon basin and in other sites. But to perform optimal foraging theory estimates, you need a form of data that's particularly hard to gather. You need handling times and search times. So in regions like mine, where hunting is criminalized and a hunter is loath to admit that they hunt, let alone let you go into the field with them and record, it took, Hunter Wong X amount of time to butcher this muntjac. It took him 20 minutes. It's extremely hard to gather this form of data compared to these other two parameters. So to build some intuition, deriving reservation values from this economic optimal stopping time problem uses essentially a Bellman equation. And I show this graphically to build intuition. So if we have a hypothetical set of individuals, this could be one species, this could be across multiple species, the hunter's problem is, in that moment of time, when I see something that has a trait value of, say, 100, should I let it go or should I shoot it? And you have some expected utility gain from waiting, letting this guy that's 100 trait units, keep on walking by and wait for your next opportunity to shoot. And that declines, because you can think, well, the probability that I'm going to see something that's better than 100 trait values is pretty small. May as well take this guy. But if I see something that's like 5 trait values, maybe I should wait for something better to pass on by. So the opportunity cost that I mentioned earlier, we just need to translate this to the same units as their utility gain for waiting. So they can be in units of economic currency, or they can be in units of energetic currency, or other units. And where this opportunity cost intersects with this utility gain from waiting curve, you get the reservation value falling out. So in this hypothetical example, my reservation value would be 39 trait values. Anything I see above 39 trait values, I should harvest. So I calculated reservation values for a set of hunters in Southwest China using interview data that I'll be discussing in the next section. And what you see on the y-axis is their reservation value for individual hunters, which ranges from 5 grams to 80 kilograms. So for an individual here, let's say, if you see a muntjac or anything bigger than that, you should go for it. And on the x-axis is the opportunity cost borne by these hunters going into the field. So the alternative things that they could be doing with their time include rubber tapping, which is their main source of income. They're primarily rubber smallholders in this region. Or they could be pursuing other forms of entertainment or leisure. So what what these colors show you are different scaling factors. So what this first curve showed is that if your opportunity cost is above about like 11 USD per trip, it's not economically rational for you to go hunting. The prey base is just simply too defaulated given current values of domestic alternatives to the types of animals that they're harvesting, for instance, chicken or poultry or beef. However, if you include a scaling factor for the value of bushmeat that encompasses things like the gustatory preference for wild meat over domestic meat, or the amenity value of being out in the field and recreating with your friends, then what you see is eventually, for a sufficiently high scaling factor, it's economically rational for individuals paying high opportunity costs to go into the field and to hunt. And you see across all of these curves that individuals who pay a higher opportunity cost should be less selective. They should have a lower reservation value. They should harvest a wider range of species. And it makes sense because if you think, my time's extremely valuable, you don't necessarily want to be in the field for 2, 3, 4, 5 days. Whereas if you didn't value your time very highly, you would be willing to wait for the best possible shot. So I contrasted the range of reservation values, again on the y-axis here, from 5 grams to 80 kilograms, against actual bag data that was recorded by a subset of hunters in China with whom I had trusted relationships. So what you see here is on the x-axis the natural log of the grams of the catch that the hunters made. What's notable is this landscape is so defaulated that on the typical trip they're only catching one organism per trip and usually returning home afterwards. So this shows you that the majority of the catches are about in the size range of little small birds, and a smaller group of them, the hunters are managing to come back with a mammal, usually a muntjac or a wild boar. And this range of body masses is captured by the range of reservation values that was determined for that population of hunters in Southwest China, given that scaling factor gamma. On the other hand, I contrasted this with optimal foraging theory, and optimal foraging theory would indicate that only individuals harvesting mammals are behaving in an optimal fashion, according to that set of rules. One major issue is that I had to use surrogate handling times from sites in South America, as I wasn't able to estimate handling times myself due to the sensitivity of hunting. So one exciting thing about the reservation value is it can improve the monitoring value of hunter bags. So to date, the main method for monitoring wildlife in the field or in understanding the impacts of harvest on multi-species communities are point-and-line transects, which could be pretty gnarly. You might have to get some pretty inaccessible sites where there have been landslides, and it's intensive in terms of personnel skill, financial resources, and time. On the other hand, you can do fairly rapid assessments with a set of caveats of hunters themselves using enumerators and interviews as well as bag data that the hunters themselves can record and provide to researchers, provided that there is a sufficiently trustworthy relationship. So here's a set of simulated data to try to illustrate how I think this reservation value can improve the monitoring value of hunter bags. What you see here is, again, a simulated set of trait values. The black distribution is, say, an expected or a historical distribution of a community of prey or a population of a single species. And what's happened in actuality is that that curve's been shifted to the left. There's been a lot of heavy harvest targeting the big-bodied guys. And as a researcher, I would like to know, or as a manager, I'd like to know, has there been a detectable, measurable shift in the community that I am managing? So if you know like some average reservation value, say it's down here in terms of trait values, or you have some sense across a population of hunters what their reservation values are, what you can then do is simulate what you'd expect the bags to look like and compare it with what they actually look like to see if there is evidence of a shift using this simple metric. So the exciting thing about this technique is that it has extremely minimal data requirements that match the scope of existing data collection and data gathering efforts in the tropics. They provide a threshold for otherwise seemingly indiscriminate harvesting that can be useful for modeling and management. and they may be able to enhance the monitoring value of hunter bag data. So the second section, I'll be focused on a case study of a population of hunters in southwest China. So my field site, the inspiration for all this work is in southwest China, in this province, Yunnan, outlined in red, and in this area highlighted in blue, Xishuangbanna. It is an ethnic minority region, and it has 5 protected areas, all of which are surrounded by village residences. And as you can see in this photo, the primary livelihood for villagers in this region is now smallholding, primarily of rubber. So the exciting thing about rubber smallholding is it's really liberated them from poverty. In 20 years, they've gone from subsistence poverty to the kind of wealth where some families can own Mercedes-Benz SUVs that they don't drive. They have to show off. And in this section, I did 50 interviews with a snowball sampling approach so that I would get trusted informants. And we used semi-structured and quantitative interviews to look into their motivations for hunting, the preference they had for different animal species, and this type of dynamic that I'll be calling exit entry. So basically their propensity to quit hunting after some hypothetical scenario of species or animal encounter in the field. And then this is where we also collected the bag records that I presented in the previous section. So to assess what the motivations of this community of hunters was, we gave them 4 options: recreation, based on pilot interviews, bushmeat hunting, the taste of wild meat specifically. None of the villages that I've worked in have a subsistence protein concern anymore. They're all meeting or exceeding protein targets, and they have ready access to domestic livestock, finances, and a fill-in-the-blank field other. So what we found was that recreation was ranked most highly as the dominant driver of hunting in this landscape. When people filled in the blank, they reiterated that hunting is really fun. They really wanted us to know this fact, to understand that fact. Bushmeat came in as a very distant second, and finances as a very distant third motivation, in large part because bushmeat markets are now illegal in China. So the value that you would get as a hunter selling your meat at the market is outweighed by the fact that it's hard to get bushmeat. Maybe it's better to enjoy it yourself or informally share it with your friends and family. From the semi-structured interviews, we further fleshed out the motivations of this population of hunters who stated things like hunting's mainly recreational, why even bother going out to hunt? There's nothing really left in the forest, but we really love it. Going to forest to hunt is fun. There's not any real benefits associated with hunting, at least in this landscape in Xishuangbanna. And most intriguingly, they reported some forms of bottom-up cooperation to limit the efficacy of enforcement, where if you snitch on me, I will make sure that you pay. So what this population of hunters also revealed is that they have a preference, as has been documented in many other sites around the world, that they prefer larger-bodied species. And to assess how they might respond in the future to continued declines in the game populations in this region, we used entry-exit questionnaires. So we gave them scenarios where we said for 3 different taxa, large mammals, birds, and small birds, given the current baseline of catch, would you continue hunting if you could only get this group of animals and nothing else? And then we reduced that to 50% of the current catch, 20 and 10% of the current catch. The current catch for most of these groups is really low. It's like 1 maybe for the typical hunting trip. So instead of giving them fractional catch, we use scenarios such as, would you continue hunting if it took you now 2 trips to get your 1 boar or muntjac instead of half a boar or muntjac per trip? Because that doesn't make sense realistically. So what we found was that on the x-axis, this shows you the expected biomass catch of the typical 2-day trip, going from really, really small amount, just grams, to 100 kilograms. And on the y-axis shows you the proportion of the respondents who would be willing to continue hunting. And what we see is that for the large mammals, there's still a pretty high willingness to continue hunting, even when your encounter rates are extremely low. And assuming they interpreted this correctly, you're only encountering large mammals in these scenarios. You don't get to harvest birds. They're still willing to go out into the field. Most intriguingly is the fact that even with extremely low catch rates of just small birds, they're still willing to go out and hunt, gesturing again and kind of underlying the argument that the hunters were making, that they really do hunt out of a recreational, leisure-based imperative rather than a material imperative alone. So from the hunting bag data, we determined that the average trip length is about 2 days. They usually go in small hunting parties, sometimes alone, sometimes with one friend. And their successful catch is indeed extremely low, lower than the initial baseline that we used. So it's like 1 in 4 trips do they manage to get a boar, and only 1 out of every 2 trips do they manage to get a game bird. So we followed this up with a broader landscape scale survey of 200 villagers to think about who does and who does not hunt. And this section was really only possible by working with Sophie Williams, a really talented young researcher at Bangor University and in Sichuanbana, and these 2 awesome young enumerators, Li Yuezhao and Zhu Xiaoming, who spoke the local dialect and were really charming and were fantastic to work with. So we interviewed 200 adult men about hunting activity, which is highly sensitive. For the typical village respondent, they have no incentive to say, yes, I totally hunted that in the last year. Yes, I have a gun. You know, all these things are legal, and I've done all of them. I'm just going to tell you now, I've done them all. So that's a really hard thing to do. We also measured predictors of hunting. So we measured these non-sensitive covariates, their ethnicity, their income, the plants that they grow, the harvest that they receive, some other leisure-based covariates, the number of outdoors activities they do, their attitudes toward hunting, and entertainment activities that they pursue. So to ask them about their hunting activity, we used 2 questioning techniques. We used direct questioning in the past year, for instance, have you hunted bulbul? Or have you hunted pheasant? Have you hunted barbet? But we also used this indirect survey technique that has been shown by political scientists and sociologists to reduce response bias. It's called the randomized response technique, and the premise is that by giving the respondents some degree of anonymity, they throw a randomizer, I don't know what the randomizer landed on, I don't really know what the outcome is, so I can't be sure if when they say a yes or a no, if it's a true yes or a no. They might have been forced to by the randomizer. So the expectation is that this anonymity should cut through some of the response bias that you see with really sensitive prompts. With another collaborator, Martin Cruijff at the University of Utrecht, I built an R package to analyze these data because they're a pain in the butt to analyze with existing techniques. And to walk you through how the forced response is implemented, I have this little slide. So imagine that Singli is an adult villager that I'm interviewing. I give Singli a dice and I tell him to roll it, and to roll in such a way that I, as the enumerator, can't see what the outcome is. So he rolls it behind like a little covering. And if it lands on 1, he's supposed to say yes. If it lands on 6, he's supposed to say no. And 2 through 5, he should answer honestly, yes or no. And yes, you know, I did hunt this bird, or no, I didn't hunt this bird. To ensure that the respondents understood how this question is implemented and to facilitate their understanding that it helps preserve anonymity, we used 2 training questions. The first was, do you play cards? Everyone plays cards. And the second was, do you drink? Pretty much all the adult men in this landscape drink baijiu. So those were our training questions, highly prevalent in non-sensitive behaviors. So what we can then do is we can take this classification matrix and use likelihood statements to recover the true rates of hunting for each of the focal bird species. And that's what the package Zapster does. And if you're curious, please take a look at my GitHub and tell me if there's any areas where the vignette or the documentation is unclear. So in the past year, from 2015 to 2016, the prevalence of bird hunting was about 1 in 5 men, as many as nearly 1 in 3 men hunting bulbuls, the most common and resilient bird species in this landscape. Very few adult men had successfully, at least, hunted any of these birds. But I would posit that the low prevalence revealed for these birds indicates that they're extremely rare in this landscape. Given that a hunter encountered something as good as a silver pheasant or a partridge, they would probably seek to take it over a bulbul. It's just that they're very, very rare and hard to find. We also did a regression model, just as good old statistical regression, to ascertain what factors are or are not predictive of being a hunter in this landscape. So the covariates included ethnicity and age, these sociodemographic covariates, economic factors, and attitudes. The notion that hunting is fun, or the notion that hunting is risky, or a perception that I am or am not skilled enough to hunt. And then we also included a few covariates that I labeled recreational. So the number of entertainment activities individuals pursue, the number of outdoor activities that they do, and other variables. So out of this whole set of predictor variables, the only ones that emerged in the most supported model was this notion that hunting birds is fun, that there was an indication that the number of entertainment activities is important, but it's not really clear what the effect direction is, if it's positive or negative. That's probably due to our relatively small sample size and the fact that it's a low prevalence behavior, even when we do joint inference over all 4 bird species. And the other predictor that emerged in the model from the candidate set was the number of outdoors activities that these individuals are doing in the field. So individuals who are in the field more, who like to do things like harvesting mushrooms and harvesting wild vegetables, and I'm blanking on the last one, fishing, were also more likely to hunt. And to reiterate the point that subsistence poverty is not at least a zeroth level concern for these individuals, their land holdings are extremely large. One family had 42 hectares of land that they farmed, particularly compared to the rest of China. So compared to their neighbors, so to speak, they have extremely large land holdings. Their income is higher than the average Chinese rural villager. And most significantly, more than 1 in 3 households had a car, which is a very, very significant indicator of wealth in China and in other parts of Asia, where even for urbanites, having a car is a significant attainment and an achievement in and of itself. So the last section of the research I'll be presenting today focuses on this problem of size bias defaunation and what rules we can do to try to understand and predict which species are particularly likely to be driven to extirpation. So this project was done in collaboration with Matt Burgess at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And here I present, just for one individual species, the really good old standard logistic regression model, nothing fancy. So if we model a wildlife species, so say a gaur or a pheasant or a bamboo rat as n, then we can model the rate of change of its population, assuming that's governed by logistic growth. So there's some intrinsic rate of increase, R, multiplied by its current abundance, and then you have its carrying capacity denoted by K, and it's harvested in a mass action process that is given by Q, catchability, so the proportional mortality per unit effort, and E, which is hunter effort. So when we look at this type of equation, what we quickly observe, like a really classical canonical result, is that the ratio of R, the intrinsic rate of increase over catchability, sets a limit on the maximum level of effort that any species can tolerate under harvest. My argument is that we can take this somewhat abstract term of effort, which has really been successfully quantified in fisheries, but I would argue much less well done in terrestrial hunting systems. We can turn it into terms that are commonly measured across terrestrial landscapes. We can represent effort as a combination of current human population density, the average per person hunting time. I was quite surprised, but this is a parameter that has been estimated by ethnographers at a variety of sites, and pi, the prevalence of hunting. It's kind of weird terminology because pi is often used to denote profits, but because in previous work I used pi to denote the proportion of people who were harvesting, I chose to remain consistent in my notation. So now we can represent effort using this expression. And what we can then say is there should be some upper bound on the proportion of the population that's hunting that any given species can withstand in some kind of spatially explicit, gridded fashion. So I determined pi max, or this maximum or this maximum prevalence of hunting for a variety of species using IUCN red-listed mammals. So all of those that are threatened due to hunting, so that is criteria 5.1 and 5.3, I believe. And I included all least concern and non-threatened mammal species. I used several global trait databases compiled by researchers such as Kate Jones and Nathan Meervold, who's actually a software engineer but really loves penguins and other birds, and S.K. Morgan Ernest at University of Florida. And I calculated Rmax for 300 or 400 species using this traditional equation that was developed by Lamont Cole in the 50s. And it's still the state of the art. There's a better estimator developed by folks at Stanford, but it's a bit hard to calculate because one of the parameters is often not estimated in the field. So to use Cole's equation to calculate Rmax, which unfortunately we otherwise don't have, we don't have these nice databases for animals that say like, oh, it's like, you know, it's like this mass and it breeds this much and it's this intrinsic rate of increase and it's this catchability. All we need is we just need the age at first and last reproduction, and we need litter size in terms of female offspring. And then we can determine pi max using this intrinsic rate of increase, catchability, which I estimated from 30 sites, human population density, which is estimated on a somewhat regular basis by NASA, and this handling, or it's not handling time, sorry, this average hunting time in the field parameter that I estimated from ethnographic research in the tropics. So what you see here is for those 330 species, threat category is shown on the X. So these are endangered and critically endangered species. These are species that are vulnerable and species that are of least concern or only near threatened. And for each species in that group, this is just a box plot of the range of pi maxes that they can withstand. And there is evidence that species that are highly threatened have a lower, on average, a lower maximum prevalence of hunting that they can withstand, given by their innate physiology or their biology. Another way to think about this, like if there's empirical support for this really dead simple expectation that I set out earlier, is to look at site inventories, which also unfortunately are quite limited for mammals. But there's a few sources. So one is the team network, the Tropical Ecology and Assessment Monitoring Team, across 7 tropical sites. Another is this bioinventory database compiled at UC Davis. And I combined that with human population density and protected areas, since nearly all of these estimates, or nearly all inventories that I was able to access, are coming from within or around protected areas themselves. So this way I get a pretty decent sense, at least a first guess, of what the population density is at a site, and then what the mammalian outcomes are. So you could think that I have a set of inventories that for a site in Southeast Asia ranges from mammals as small as this little dormice to ones as big as this gaur that's being attacked by all these tulls, like a really magnificent, awesome wild canid. I love tulls. And gaur are huge, like 1,000 kilograms. And I also have sites from the neotropics, which suffered from the Pleistocene overkill, so that these sites don't have, these really massive charismatic megafauna anymore. And then the maximum body mass that you can see at most sites is essentially given by tapir. So given that the biggest thing that you can expect to see is tapir, what proportion of this original assemblage are we seeing at these sites that persists over time? Again, quite imperfect data, so I'd really appreciate any recommendations on this part. And it's quite messy. So from 30 sites that I've been able to initially compile, Afrotropical sites shown in yellow, neotropical sites shown in green, and Southeast Asian sites shown in this maroon color. What you see on the x-axis is at that site the human population density, and the y-axis shows you the proportion of the maximum body size. So in South America, that'd be a tapir. In Asia, for instance, that would be a gaur. I excluded elephants and rhinoceros since they are not hunted under this kind of indiscriminate hunting mechanism that I was interested in looking at. And similar for the Afrotropical sites. So what we see is some support, weak empirical support that sites with higher human population densities tend to be more defaunated. And these dotted lines are very, very vague attempts at some kind of confidence band for what that relationship should look like, based on the equation that I highlighted before and a few parameters that I estimated. So I then sought to formalize this process by building a very, very simple theoretical model of hunting under this kind of indiscriminate open access type of situation. For many sites, we unfortunately don't have detailed life histories on harvested mammals and birds. We don't necessarily know the status of these populations, like their abundance patterns over time. And for hunters, we don't necessarily know what alternative activities are vying for a hunter's time. We don't know if their alternative activities are, for instance, working in a city, which would really draw them away from this rural forested landscape, or if it's farming, which would keep them there. We don't necessarily have a way to estimate critical parameter values for existing classes of models, agricultural production functions and other types of techniques. My field site showed me that it's really hard to accurately measure things like penalties when people don't even want to admit to hunting in the first place, let alone costs versus profits of hunting or selling your meat at the market. On the other hand, we do have a good grasp of mammalian and avian body masses. There is decent empirical support, actually no, strong empirical support for allometric scaling relationships. We have good estimates of human population density that I relied on in that previous analysis. And we know that hunting is pursued alongside many other activities, so that people are drawn into the field for a variety of reasons, including things like harvesting mushrooms that I mentioned earlier, gathering rattan, so that even when the prey base is quite limited, individuals may still be drawn into the forest to look for these sure bet or these critically needed and wanted goods. And in the in the third part of my talk, I showed that we can accurately estimate the rates of sensitive activities, even when we can't necessarily estimate the drivers behind these conservation crimes. So this leads me to demonstrate or to describe a simple theoretical model where I try to describe what the largest surviving species would be in some hypothetical assemblage. So it's a really simple compartment model where I assume you have some maximum effort in a spatially explicit kind of grid cell that's bound by human population density and the average, like this pool of hours, like the average number of per person time that they're going to spend in the field, T sub h. And what we care about is realized effort, which I denoted as pi. So we have some pool of the hunters that are active at any given time, and they flow into some exited hunter status at a rate nu, which is attenuated by their valuation of, in this initial case, big and small-bodied prey, which is also controlled by a scaling parameter phi. And then you can think that exited hunters are sitting at home, they're like, hey, I want to check out, what's going on in the forest. I kind of miss it. I want to go take a look, see if there's anything good. So people who are exited at home may re-enter hunting at some background rate beta that we could, again, estimate potentially with interviews. And then I combined this with a recruitment and a harvest process for, in the two species model, a megafauna and a hypothetical minifauna. And I extended this to a community model of 10 species using an allometric scaling relationship where the only thing that varied between species was given by their body mass. So for instance, intrinsic rate of increase scaled decliningly, or declined with body mass, and catchability was basically like a heaviside step function. If they were a big-bodied megafauna, they got a larger catchability based on the parameters that I was able to estimate from the literature. Same with carrying capacity. So what this simple model output shows is the prevalence of hunting, shown in this black curve over time, and the normalized biomass of the community of harvested species. So I posit that this can be just a helpful conceptual tool for managers and researchers interested in indiscriminate hunting in the tropics. And it can give you, just this like simple approach, can give you some kind of estimate of what your system's maximum body mass might be absent management. So if, things continue on a business as usual path, people go into the field and they hunt for reasons out of subsistence or out of selling to the market, and they are not necessarily paying penalties, or they're not complying with best practices based on species restrictions or gear restrictions or seasonal restrictions. This super simple model gives you some kind of null expectation for what might happen in your system. And then we can forecast potential scenarios under different combinations of human population density on the X and the average effort, which I assume is somewhat fixed. This is obviously a very, very generous assumption on the Y. And then we can get these kinds of bands for what they look extremely coarse, and that's mostly because I just simulated it with a fairly small amount of species and body mass values. But we can get a sense of, okay, if my site is here, in parameter space, and if nothing happens, if enforcement doesn't step up or best practices aren't pursued, this might be what eventually happens to the wildlife community. I might lose everything that's above 50 kilograms. So to summarize, I found that the motivations for hunters in Southwest China was the thrill of the chase and cultural preferences for hunting and for bushmeat. The factors that distinguished hunters from non-hunters in Southwest China were not economic. Instead, they were recreational in scope. I argue that simple rules can predict which set of species will be harvested in otherwise indiscriminate systems. And then this last section, which is the most tentative, I sought to demonstrate that megafauna are simply too big to survive at many sites due to allometric scaling under kind of opportunistic exploitation. And I've found some very preliminary evidence supporting that first simple intrinsic species limit analysis. So to close, my research has really sought to look into socio-ecological linkages, particularly when human behavior is criminalized, and to try to devise ways to accurately understand and estimate what this process and what these feedbacks are. So at Nimbus, I'm excited to work with Sing Lee and Paul and others, so please talk to me afterwards if you're interested, on ecosystem impacts of defaunation, particularly given that researchers have observed time and again that the largest bodied seed dispersers, frugivores, or herbivores are being lost from sites. So I plan to do a meta-analysis and then use some type of approach. If the theory pans out, then probably based on the theoretical expectation, what vertebrate communities might look like in the future. And then maybe simulate, going forward, what plant composition may look like under different scenarios of vertebrate community composition. And the second project seeks to compare different monitoring strategies for conservation interventions. So if we think about a variety of sites, you might have a patch that has its full complement of species, one that's more defaunated and one that's extremely defaunated. And it's often useful to understand where we should prioritize limited enforcement muscle, so to speak, or where we should prioritize sites for protection in the case of uplisting sites. So that in part depends on what the dynamics of the human harvesters themselves are. Are they all going to this site because it's the best? Or is it the kind of thing where, despite this being the best patch because of, say, like territoriality, for lack of a better word, whereas communities may say, this is my site and you're an outsider, you can't harvest at my site. Effort is much more diffusely spread across all of these patches, despite some being extremely defaunated. And we'd also like to have a sense of how different types of monitoring techniques can help us track patches over time to try to forestall this type of outcome. If this is patch 1 at time step 1, and that becomes this at time step 3. So I plan to compare traditional wildlife surveys in a simulation or a theoretical approach against human subjects interviews using the kind of R package and the approach that I developed earlier in the talk, and against very emerging techniques such as DNA barcoding. And where possible, I would plan to compare these techniques against market data in landscapes where bushmeat is sold to markets, and to look at how these different techniques can offer complementary sources of information and how a manager may choose to allocate resources among these different strategies. And as Sing Lee mentioned, I've worked on agroforests in the past. So I've worked on Ronan's marmoset in Brazil, avian habitat specialist responses to rubber plantations in China and coffee plantations in India, and this is an active area of interest. For those of you who are interested in similar lines of work, please talk to me after. And I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators, my funding sources, and thank you all for coming today. Paul? Oh, should we? Yeah. Oh.
So thank you, Charlotte.
Oh, no.
So obviously, a theme through the work is that, particularly the first things you told us about, is that recreational hunting is quite different to subsistence hunting, or you didn't talk about it, but the sort of the more conventionally studied commercial harvesting. And I very much agree with that. I suspect it's quite understudied relative to the other two kinds of hunting. But it made me wonder about other things that might flow from that. So, for example, later in the talk, in your survey work, you gave us hunting as a binary. Who is a hunter or not? Mm-hmm. And in your model, you talked about an average amount of effort. Yeah. And I actually wonder, when it comes to recreational hunting, whether the average or the binary are actually quite misleading. That if we had effort and we had some distribution of effort across your 200 individuals, right, how skewed that would be. Is it the case that a few recreational hunters actually exert all the effort?
Yes, that's a great question. My sense, at least from my site in China, is that it is somewhat skewed, but less so than one would expect, given that I argue that it's a leisure-based activity. And I think in part it's because this landscape is transitioning from a period of time where hunting was really driven by subsistence. So it's still avidly pursued by individuals across the spectrum of skill. Like we had bag data from hunters who are coming back with nothing multiple times. And it's like, why are you even bothering going out then? So my sense is that, at least in this kind of transitional period where communities are moving out of subsistence hunting or away from market-based hunting toward recreational hunting because they're liberated from those kinds of concerns, that a wide variety of individuals might elect to go into the field. And of course, like, data would be great, and that was unfortunately the kind of data that I wasn't able to gather.
Have you connected with the group over at the Center for Wildlife Health that's doing bushmeat studies? Did you know there's a group doing that on this campus?
I didn't know that. Thank
you,
Suzanne.
This is Marcy Sousa and some of the people working with her. So I don't know it's the same thing, but it's more focused in Africa, I think. And then I actually have a math question, just so we can have a math question.
Great.
Are you really using Bellman equations to solve an optimal stopping time problem, and how did you do that?
So the formal proof of the method set out by Lippmann and McCall in the 70s, it was an economics of job search problem. Technically used martingales, and it has been described as like a Bellman equation-like problem in that you have to behave optimally at each time step. That's the assumption that undergirds it. In practice, the way that I solved it was I took those parameter values for opportunity cost and I just minimized, given the empirical trait distribution of body masses, which I rescaled to hunter value using domestic protein alternative prices multiplied by that scaling factor. And I found the epsilon that minimized that function.
So you were doing like a scalar optimization as opposed to like optimal stopping time problems, which would be have a underlying variable time or space or whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And it's Marcy Susan? Great, thanks.
So you have to re-estimate some. You'd have to re-estimate some constants like TH if you did this. But I mean, you have a way of going from population density of humans to when megafauna goes extinct, right? You could can you invert that? There's a big question of like humans selling the Americas and megafauna extinction then. Yeah. And so you use your reverse of your things to figure out like human density over time and.
That's a great suggestion. I hadn't thought of that. And we'd actually, Matt had suggested using the Pleistocene data, like John Alroy's paper, as a test to make sure that this like simple process explains this like fairly well-studied, well-documented extinction process. But I hadn't thought of that. Thanks, Brian.
So I had a question that kind of ties in with the hunter-prey choice and the recreational hunting. So people are going out and they're hunting because it's fun, and part of it being fun may be whether they're being successful or not, right? And there's probably some prestige associated with bringing home something large. But is there an instance there where people are out there just shooting something as having fun? So shooting the small birds, they're not even bringing them back?
Yeah.
So that happens?
Yes, that absolutely happens. So it's interesting. Although their preference scales with body mass in this kind of monotonic increasing fashion, there is this other aspect that I couldn't really capture, unfortunately, because talking about gun shooting is even more sensitive than talking about taking animals in some vague way. And there is definitely exactly what you observed, that there is a kind of reputational bonus that you get from being the guy who can like kill this tiny booble.
And then do you end up with underreporting from people, do you think, who aren't saying that they just went out and shot something and left it there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think so, because we did get data sheets back where they would report, like, I got the 1 bulbul, or I got the 5, I got the 5 barbets or something. So I don't think that was a massive source of bias, but it is like a really, really small data set. If I was to try to expand that study, for instance, it'd be quite challenging due to a variety of kind of legal and reputational
It's one of
issues.
those things where you start thinking about how you might change behavior in a community. And as a birder, I'd like to have all those small birds out there to look at.
Yes.
But there are places where people are just out there shooting them, and it makes it a lot harder to, of course, control for them, but it affects the population at the same time.
Yeah, there have been a variety of really interesting conservation interventions that have been suggested to me, including things as capital intensive but exciting as like virtual reality shooting for this population of hunters, to I think something more traditional like skeet shooting. And I think there could be viable alternatives, or even a managed kind of something like the mourning dove shoots for this population. The problem is there's a lack of political will. The current Forestry Bureau has no interest in even acknowledging the hunting is happening, let alone letting researchers into the forest. Singly, or?
Hello. First of all, I'd like to say that I find very impressive how you mixed a lot of approaches together to make your point. And so now it's said. I would like to speak also about whether this hunting is recreational or for social status, because to me it seems ambiguous, notably because social status hunting would predict strong cultural preferences, which seem to be the case. And there is a dramatic difference between the two, in my opinion, because fun is done for fun, but if this is for social status, this depends on social norms that can be engineered at a very low political capital cost.
Right.
So I know David Sloan Wilson did some stuff like that for health, and like whether this is recreational or not will be major for this. So
Cool. Yeah, no, thank you for those points. Would you mind sending me that paper that you mentioned?
yeah, no
the
problem.
health intervention? Yeah, that sounds great. And I agree. I don't really have in my mind a good way to clearly distinguish to what extent one factor is more important than the other.
So you mentioned at the end that you're interested in trying to incorporate DNA barcoding into your analyses, and I'm just curious how you envision that helping you gain more insight into this problem.
So this is motivated in large part by current data gathering efforts at my field site, where because of extremely limited skilled personnel who can do wildlife surveys, one technique that's become very popular is using gathering leeches in the field and then metabarcoding them to try to roughly pinpoint what mammals may still be extant. So there is a potential data set from this study landscape, and for a variety of political reasons, this may be highly embraced in China as it seeks to solidify its reputation as being like very scientifically oriented, technocratic, and like leading in this form of monitoring. So that's the motivation, because it is otherwise a quite expensive and emerging technique. Yeah.
You'd be using the DNA to try to figure out exactly what species are still present in a given
Yeah,
forest,
my
essentially?
impression is that from I wouldn't be doing any of that work myself, but using parameters from that group.
Okay.
My impression from that group is that the preliminary data are unfortunately quite messy because of the low prevalence of mammals, which also leads to a low prevalence of leeches. But there may be some interesting story in there. I'm not sure.
Cool.
Yeah. Paul?
An invitation to perhaps lead us a bit deeper into some results that went by. So I'm going back to the survey design. You had two kinds of questions. You had your direct questions and then your randomized response technique.
Yeah.
Now, if we take that randomized response technique as an estimate of truth or closer to it, then you actually have an estimate by comparing that to the direct question of the bias
Yeah.
from direct questioning studies. So have you done anything to go back and revisit past direct questioning studies and say, well, how far off might those have been? Or to decompose the bias based on other factors in there? Because you could decompose it by the kinds of species or by hunter demography.
So in my landscape, there unfortunately haven't been any previous assessments of hunting activity. This was, I think, like to my knowledge, the first that did a comprehensive survey of individuals in this landscape. But other researchers at other sites have noted this difference, which I also note, but I unfortunately don't have historical data to backcast to, which would be awesome.
Are there any obvious correlates or covariates that predict when someone is going to give you false answers on direct questioning?
I looked into it, and there was not based on ethnicity or other demographic covariates, but I do need to take another look at that particular set of analyses. That'd be cool.
So I've got a suggestion. So you mentioned about John Elroy's Pleistocene.
Yep.
You mentioned about John Elroy's Pleistocene data set. So he has a data set called Ecological,
Oh.
with all the site level composition data.
What?
So that might be really interesting for you. Yeah.
Plant composition or animal?
No, mammals.
Oh, from Pleistocene.
No,
overkill
not
sites?
Pleistocene. Current day.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So I've got another question regarding stats.
Yeah.
So when you were doing the regressions to look at the correlates of
Yeah.
hunting behavior, did you use the response variables from the RRT
Yes.
analysis?
Yeah.
So how would that compromise power?
So I jointly did inference over all 4 species to try to increase statistical power, but yeah, I have very limited statistical power due to the fact that it's low prevalence
Yeah.
and I have a small sample size.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, when you compare the RRT to when you are assuming that the response variable is like definitely true,
Right.
that results in the reduction in power. That's why perhaps all the confidence intervals are like super
Yeah,
wide.
are very noisy. Yeah. But it was interesting. Outdoors activities didn't cross that line, but again, I don't know. I think the most intriguing thing to take away is it tells us what factors are important
Yeah.
in separating these groups of individuals, but I'm not optimistic or confident that it tells us like this guy is definitely.
Yeah, because the response variables are still unbiased.
Yeah.
It's just that, there's added error.
Yes.
to it.
Yeah. And I could only survey so many people, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Great. If there's no further questions, thank you all so much. I'm here in Claxton. Please say hi. Thanks.